Okay, well, let's see if I can do this. All right. I have a green light. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Once again, thank you for coming tonight. I want to start off with asking you about the stories of World War II, which we've commonly heard, many stories, especially in Germany and Auschwitz. Why was this perspective in the Nightingale important to tell, and why did you focus on France particularly?
Well, first, let me say thank you so much. I can't tell you what an honor it is to be here. It's your campus is beautiful. I feel so welcomed, and I really appreciate you inviting me. You know, the way sort of the Nightingale came about, is this too loud? I'm not used to being quite so robust. The way the Nightingale came about was many, many years ago when I was writing another book called Winter Garden that was about World War II Russia. I came across the first of the sort of French resistance female memoirs. It was a woman named Andrée Dijon, and she was a 19-year-old Belgian girl, and she started one of the first escape routes out of Nazi-occupied France. And I was just so taken with her story and so amazed at the bravery and the courage, especially in one so young. And, you know, obviously I couldn't use this research in my Russia book, but it got me started researching World War II France and the women of the French resistance. And sort of the more I read about it, honestly, just the more fascinated I became. And when I started reading about the women who were hiding Jewish children and were helping getting Jewish families and children out of France, I started to sort of be actively angry that with as much as I read and as much as I know about World War II, that I didn't know these stories. And I really felt that these women's stories deserve to be told. And so I then waited for someone braver to write the book, because I knew it would be a huge undertaking, and I just didn't know. You know, I felt like I'm not a historian, I'm, you know, not a PhD, I wasn't sure that I was the person to write this story. But then the more, you know, the more I was compelled by it, the more I realized sort of that it felt like my gift to have found this story and to tell it.
Thank you. There are also many relationships depicted in the book, and especially through mothers and daughters, sisters, mothers and sons, especially, both adopted and biological. What was the most compelling relationship that you found?
Well, the core of the novel is really the sisters' relationship. I mean, that's really what it was about. And it was important to me that the thing that I wanted to bring to the Nightingale, that I felt I could bring to sort of World War II fiction, and the reason ultimately that I chose to undertake it, was I wanted to write a book that made you feel what it was like to be there, that more than just thinking, you know, that you would really feel what these women were feeling and the choices that they had to make. And I kept thinking as I was writing it, because especially when you start with all of the history and all of the facts you have to have at your fingertips all the time, I kept thinking to myself, I have a sister, I love my sister, and we could literally be at war and fighting over a hairbrush. I know that this could happen. And so it was really important to me that these sisters, that their relationship be about more than just the war, that it be an honest relationship that was sort of in the crucible of war, but that you could still read about them and go, you know, I would have that with my sister, or I would, you know, we would have these issues. And so that, I guess, you know, is the crucial relationship. And then beyond that, of course, the mother-child relationship is probably just slightly less important. In this book.
So you mentioned the honest relationship between women, but of course men exist, and during that time particularly, I know. But during that time, being a woman was a little different than it is now. So can you discuss gender roles of that time compared to today, and have we evolved or have things remained the same?
Well, that's a loaded question. I mean, obviously, it was a very different time, and World War II was in a lot of ways sort of the beginning of the real turning point for women, and, the roles that they took on, during the war. I think that when we look back on it, the women's fight to be taken seriously, to be considered seriously, to do what we want, to follow our own path, has always been difficult. And I think it requires great strength of character, and I think often in history, it's not, the light isn't shined on it as much as it could be.
And you also mentioned the research that you did that led you to the story of the Nightingale, the woman who led the escape routes. Was that very surprising to learn about? Did you have, or was there like a factual story that really connected you to writing about this, or did you have a personal response? Or could you tell us more about this woman as well?
Well, like I said, so originally there was André de Jong, the Belgian woman, who created the escape route. And the more I read, there were women who were couriers, women who were spies. There was a woman named Nancy Wake, an American who was living in France, who, did a lot of spy kind of things. And these women just repeatedly put their lives at risk to save strangers. And that was sort of, to me, that was the big moment in this book. And the moment that I realized I had to write it was when I sort of had the idea, when would I risk my life, and more importantly, my son's life, to save a stranger? And that's where these women and the choices that they made, and a lot of them, like Isabelle in the book, paid a very heavy price. They did go to concentration camps. They were executed. They did, it was no small risk they were taking. And I just, I think that decision for a mother is deeply personal, and the courage that it takes is remarkable and needs to be a part of, our understanding of it needs to be a part of sort of the fabric of history, not just when battles were fought and when hills were taken, but it's important to know for us women what we were doing.
You also have a character, Captain Herbeck, the German soldier, and you portray him as somewhat sympathetic considering the circumstances. Why did you decide to write him that way?
Well, I mean, the sort of easy answer is that when you decide to write about a Nazi, it's pretty clear. I mean, that this is a bad guy. That, historically this is a problem. But I also sort of felt very strongly that the point of this book was writing about human beings, and human beings in incredibly difficult situations, making incredibly difficult choices. And I just wanted to humanize sort of one German soldier to some extent. I mean, obviously he was still holding a whip, he was still, guarding, taking away food, he was still doing all of these things, but you felt that, at least in the beginning, he had perhaps been a good man before this started. And then, of course, the bad Nazi came after that,
Why was it important that you showed different dimensions of love as it comes out of crisis, such as war?
Well, love is the point. I mean, you know, love, especially I think when you're looking at, you know, sisters relationships and mother-child relationships, mother-daughter, father-son, mother-son. I mean, what is the point of any of it if it's not ultimately about loving each other and fighting for the ability to love who we love and to keep our families together during the worst of times?
And because of the different types of love that I guess that Vianne and Isabelle had to show to each other and even to the people that they were interacted with, how did they come to discern their unique paths and responses to what was happening around them?
Well, I mean, I guess I think that, you know, what I was trying to show is here are two very different women with two very different responses to the extraordinary circumstances that they were, that they found themselves in. There's Isabelle, who is 18 and headstrong and doesn't really understand the risk she's taking and sort of dives into this idea of, you know, I can be a hero, I can fight back, I can, you know, make this, I can help in this situation. And then you have her sister, who is of course a mother, and for whom the war is a very different situation. You know, she's got a child to feed, she's got a child to keep safe, she's got a best friend she's worried about. She has a lot more sort of to risk in this situation. And so I think the novel explores basically how we as individuals come to the idea of courage, bravery, heroism, when we decide and how we decide to risk our lives for other people. And the sort of price that you pay ultimately for the decisions that you made all the way along the way. One of the things that was so interesting in The Nightingale in terms of writing it was, you know, I'm writing a book about a situation and a past that we all know a lot about. But my characters didn't know the history at this point. So like there's that one scene where Beck has Vianne write a list of names. And it was a really difficult scene for me to write because, you know, I'm sitting there going, don't write, you know, don't do this. We all know now this is bad. But she didn't have that information. And so it was important for me to sort of make her as real and as true as I could, and then to understand that those are the kind of decisions that in retrospect change a life and impact deeply how you see your own past and how you see yourself.
And I want to focus on Sophie as well. She was a young girl when the war started, and she was able to view the different reactions that her mother had and that her aunt had. How do you think she views her mother and her aunt? And do you think she understood what was happening at the time and understood the different decisions that they had to make?
Well, certainly she didn't understand when she was young, but I would say that, you know, having Beck live in their home and then having von Richter live in their home and growing up in war, I think, you know, children learn very quickly. And so, yes, I think she understood at a certain age very, very deeply what her mother was doing and the choices that her mother was making. And I think that's why she and her mother were so allied in sort of keeping these secrets for their lives.
And especially, do you think her relationship with, like, having that friend, her name was Sarah, was that, like, kind of the same thing she had to go through as well?
I'm not sure
Sarah,
I understand.
Like, she...
Yep.
They were both young, but having that kind of sister as well, someone so young.
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, I just wanted to sort of show, you know, two children shaped by war, but in vastly different circumstances.
And the title of the book, The Nightingale, we learn is eventually Isabelle's code name or nickname. Does that mean that the book is ultimately Isabelle's story told by Anne, and what is the thought process behind naming it The Nightingale?
Well, so this is a behind the curtains look at how it really works as an author. I turned the book in unpublished, untitled. I tried. I spent, several years writing the book. You'd think I could come up with a title. I could not. And so, obviously her name was Rossignol, and her, the Nightingale was her code name. Didn't occur to me that that was the title. And so I sent it in to my editor, and I sent it in to my best friend. The two of them were reading at the same time. And they both emailed me on the same day and said, this is called The Nightingale, right? Like, are you paying attention? And so no, there was no deep and hidden meaning. It was, interestingly enough, though, when I wrote the first draft, there was only Isabelle, there was no Vienne. I think I was calling it Isabelle's War at that time, yeah.
I like that. Very interesting.
I'll republish half of it.
So how can we or you relate to your characters and the choices that they made, especially today, be it social justice, politics, or inequalities?
Well, I think, honestly and sadly, I've tried to figure out sort of the impact of the Nightingale, because I've been doing this a long time. I've written a lot of books, and the response to the Nightingale has been, so surprising. And I sort of, I just have been trying to figure out why this book, why has it struck this nerve? And I think, yes, it's because it's about ordinary women doing extraordinary things. Yes, this is a great moment in time to be talking about strong women, to be reminding all of us of sort of women's lost history. I think all of that is true. But I also think that, that sadly, the world is an increasingly dangerous and intolerant place right now. And I think that the Nightingale speaks to that. I think a lot of us have looked back on World War II and been unable to imagine how the world could ever get to a point like that. And it just feels a little more understandable lately.
And then what impact besides, or just any impact, do you hope the Nightingale has on the reader?
First and foremost, my goal is always to say what I have to say in a way that is difficult for a reader to put down. That's what I'm always looking for. I really do that whole try to take out all the boring parts bit. And so I really like a quick pace. I really like a lot of emotion, and I really like powerful female characters. And so I guess ultimately, in a perfect world, a reader will say, I love this book, it really changed how I think about something, and I couldn't put it down. That's what I'm ultimately looking for, I guess.
I think that was me when I didn't put it down, and I did get very emotional while reading it.
Yeah, you don't want to be like operating heavy machinery or something while you're reading the end of this book, yeah.
And I think everyone wants to know, especially I do, why did you keep the narrator's identity a secret until the end?
Okay, so this is interesting. So I did all this research, and I decided to, I wrote 200 pages or whatever of Isabelle's story. I decided it wasn't enough. I created the sister and, started over. And so I'm sitting down to write the book, and all of a sudden I am writing first person in what is clearly an old woman's voice. And I think, well, that's odd, because this is a book about two young women. And normally I would sort of push that aside and just sort of power through with, you know, what I intended to do. But for this particular book, the power of that voice really drew me in. And of course, what it turns out now, I can say, is I needed a character to put this in retrospect, to explain the war and put it in context. This is what my subconscious knew. I did not know this. So I'm writing in this old woman's voice. At this point, I realize I have, in my opinion, I had three choices. Is this Isabelle? Is this Vianne? Is this Rachel? And I decided then not to decide until I came to the last page of the book. And so I wrote 600 pages. I got to the scene where I moved back into the present. And I was like, okay, Kristin, it is time. You've got to pick. And I would have said that it was Isabelle. All the way through, I would have said that it was Isabelle. But when the moment came, I couldn't do it. And I think it's because Vianne's a mother. I think that was the deciding factor for me. So then I had to go back and make sure that the whole book matched that.
And relating to the end of the book and revealing what happens to the characters, and we want to know like what happened to everyone, why did you choose not to mention what happened to Antoine in the end as you did with everyone else?
Well, that's an interesting question. I have not been asked that before. I think one of the things that I was talking earlier about this, one of the things that I came across in my research over and over and over again was the way these family stories were suppressed, the way families did not pass these stories down. People in concentration camps often didn't tell their stories, didn't tell their children, and I felt that for Vianne and Antoine to make their marriage work, to keep going with everything that I believe they both knew about each other, the way that they would have done it was simply to not talk about it. And I didn't feel that it made sense in the present to go back and talk about it. So either they had to talk about it then or they didn't, and they didn't.
What would you say to the young women in the audience and want them to know?
Oh, what would I say to the young women? Let me think back to when I was a young woman in college. Well, first of all, I would say these are the best years of your life, so have a good time, study, make your parents proud. I would say that there's a lot of pressure on the young generation right now to know what they want to do, to sort of have a kind of clarity that most of us didn't get until we were 30. And so I guess I would say, I'm a perfect example of you don't know where your life is going to go. And so, to have the courage to strike out on the path that speaks to you and to follow that path and to be prepared to fail and fall and get down and rise back up again, and know that we as women will support each other, and that we all have the ability to sort of paint the future that we want to see for ourselves and to go for it. That's what I would say.
Thank you for the advice. Thank you. Well, I guess we can open it up to questions.
Is it time? Yeah. Yay. I can't see any of you. Just saying.
So there'll be two students with microphones. If you just raise your hand, I'll bring a microphone to you for the question and answer period.
She's got her hand up back there. Okay. Good job. Good job. Yeah. What am I looking at? Where am I looking? Oh.
Okay, I'm Kenya.
Hi, I met you earlier, yeah.
I have another question about the first Nazi that was in the Antoine. While I was reading, I thought they were going to have an affair. Did you portray it as that, or did you want it to? Did you want that effect, or was it actually going to happen, or why did you make it happen?
Well, I am in control of that. That was sort of, that was always on the table. I mean, I always knew that was a potential story. And it never, for me as a writer, it never even came close. I just couldn't do it. And I think that's a lot of reasons. I mean, you guys may talk about, like in your English classes, I think probably a lot about an author's voice and what is an author's voice. And it's easy to think that it's sentences, but it's as much philosophy, morality, who we are, and I would say that question comes down to who I am. And I didn't feel, I thought, life is tough enough for Vianne. She doesn't need that too.
Hi,
Is that you? Oh, hi, okay.
so when you were writing, is there like, I know you started off with Isabelle, but is there one that you would prefer more, that you relate to more?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
That's the other one. So is there a reason why you decided to let Isabelle live through everything, even though they were she put herself in danger, and then at the end she decided pneumonia?
Yeah, it's a bummer. It was obviously very difficult. I really liked Isabelle, but ultimately I felt that this novel was about very, very serious issues, and that the courage and the bravery that I was showing required absolute proof of the danger of it. And I really felt that if a book like this, everybody lives and everybody's happily ever after, then I have not portrayed my subject as honestly as I could have. But I hated that part.
Hello. My name is Kayla White. I'm a freshman here at Notre. My question that I have for you is, both of the sisters play a major role in the book. Throughout the novel, you describe their stories equally. So my question is, which one do you most relate to and why?
Oh, I'm Vianne. I want to be the one who sets up the escape route and hides in trees and saves everybody. And I'm really the one who's at home trying to make soup from a belt. I mean, I'm a mom. The reason I'm a writer is because I wanted to be an at-home mom. So she was just, she's much more who I am, which may explain the ending also.
Hello, my name is Lucy.
Hi.
I was just asking, I was wondering about the ending when it came to Rachel's family. Did you always know that you were going to have Rachel die and Ari be taken away, or did you know from the beginning?
I always knew that Ari was going to be taken away. That was absolutely hands down the hardest scene for me to write as an author. I think it is brutal. And it was another scene that I really didn't want to write about, but I felt that it was extremely important historically to sort of make that point about, you know, Ari belonging with his people. It's a very controversial subject, sort of among, you know, hidden children, but I just felt that was an important statement that I wanted to make. Hi. I hope you've read it.
I have a question. When a book is made into a movie, frequently the movie is disappointing because the pictures that you have in your head are personal and they're your own. But when you see the movie has been adapted to someone else's vision. Do you have any control over the movie process, over the screenwriting? And if so, are you happy with how the movie is turning out?
Control, no. Input, yes. You know, it's an interesting thing. I've had several books, you know, optioned into movies that have not been made. And I understand very keenly that they are two different art forms. I mean, we're all readers. I'm a reader. The book is almost always better than the movie. That is just a fundamental truth. And so you have to sort of know that going in. And part of the reason for that is The Nightingale is 160,000 words, and a screenplay is 20 to 25,000 words. So they need to cut a lot of the story. Now that being said, I read the first 2 drafts of the script, and I felt that from the get-go they nailed Isabelle's story and failed at Vianne's every time, because they didn't understand that this was the great strength of the novel, that she was an every woman, and they had a man write it. And so they brought in a woman, and now I'm extremely happy with the script. So, you know, I think it's a good story, but I don't have any control from here on. And, you know, so casting and, you know, I don't know how all of that will work. I think we have a brilliant director, so that is great. And interestingly enough, we now have a female writer, a female producer, a female director, and a female studio head. And I don't know, yeah. So, fingers crossed.
Hi, Kelsey. We met earlier or something. What was your inspiration or motivation to keep going while you're writing a novel? And what advice do you have to us as students to keep going as we're achieving our dreams?
Well, it's always the same answer. Don't give up. You know, I mean, that is always the answer, because there's always a point in any project, in any job, in anything, where it always seems easier to give up the hard thing that you're doing and reach for the thing that you're sure is easier that's coming. And there were a lot of times in The Nightingale where it sort of got unbearably hard. And I just get up the next day and I write the next scene, and I do that every day. It's, you know, that's my advice. Don't give up, keep going forward.
Hi, I'm Julie.
Hi, Julie.
I was wondering what some of your favorite novels are and authors who inspired you.
Oh. Well, I'm a Stephen King girl. I am. I have been since I was like 14 years old. Probably my favorite novel of the last few years is a book called Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. And I think it's because it sort of has the scope and the power and the emotion, and it's historical fiction. And that's really what I'm always looking for. I'm looking for that doorstop of a read that feels like it's 40 pages. That's, to me, that's the perfect novel.
Hi. So my name is Tiffany. I noticed I started to change the Anne's role throughout the book, how she progressed, and she started being more active in the war. However, when she came to the reunion and gave a speech about Isabelle, her role in the war wasn't recognized at all until the end arc came to her. Why did you make that a secret, like her role? She never pronounced what she had done during the war. Like, it wasn't her role.
Because she never told anybody. And in fact, it was interesting. I had written that scene, and I'm trying to think how long it was later, maybe 6 months after I wrote the final scene, that's about Isabelle. But we have Ari in because I had to. But I was somewhere, I don't know if it was on Facebook or whatever, but I saw this clip of a man, and I can't remember his name, which is horrible now, but he was, I don't know, I think 90, a British man. And he was at a ceremony exactly like the one that I had portrayed, at the end of the book. And what he didn't know was that everyone in the audience was related to the people that he had saved. And there were something like 650 people. And he had not told his family that he had saved people in the war until, just a few years before that. And it was so moving. And, that was sort of, like I've said earlier, part of the point of the Nightingale is tell your stories. Pass them along, get your mother's stories, get your grandmother's stories, get your dad's stories, because especially the World War II stories, they are being lost. And, they need to be passed down.
Hello, my name is Camille, and I was wondering, as a writer, what do you do to overcome writer's block?
I think, I'm not the best person to ask about that, to be honest. Writer's block is not one of the many demons that I deal with. And I think that's because I know what I want to say, and I don't ask myself to say it perfectly. Because I think the biggest stumbling block to writers going forward is you ask yourself to be perfect from the get-go and to not allow yourself the latitude to write really bad sentences and really bad scenes and really bad chapters. And the bottom line is you're not going anywhere if you can't get past writing bad stuff. And so again, it comes back to put your head down, keep doing, keep going, and trust that you will get better. You can always fix a bad scene. You can't fix a blank page. This woman back here has been holding her hand up since like the very beginning. Can we go to her? Yeah. You're welcome.
Thank you for being here. Actually, I wrote it down. The incredible character growth, mostly with Deanne. She grows from being a stereotypical mother and wife, subservient, and she grows into this hero with passions outside of her family. But as an older woman, she relates that the rest of her life was very much what it was before the war. She's very subservient to her husband, which is a sentence that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. And I was wondering, why this reversion?
Why what?
Why this regression in her character?
Okay, so that's kind of a young woman's comment, in my opinion. And I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that when we are young, we tend to see motherhood and wifehood and sort of domesticity in a certain way that feels completely limiting and completely subservient and those sorts of things. And I think that as you get older and as you experience more, you understand that freedom is a bigger concept and that marriage has bigger wings than that. And so in my opinion, Vianne ended up with the life that she wanted as a woman of her time. And I hope she ended up happy. I think she did, for all of her, tragedies.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi.
My question is, you said you closely relate to Dee, and throughout the book, she really changes like a lot. That's obvious information. And Isabelle kind of remained the same the whole entire time. And you said when you first started writing the book, it was about Isabelle. So my question is, why didn't you make her pretty, like a solid character, and have Vianne change and her sister just stay this like strong-headed person and never get like knocked down until she died?
Right. Well, I mean, in a way, Isabelle never got to experience life. She never got to grow up. So we never really knew, what she would have become. And I think she grew up, I mean, what was she, 18 in the beginning of the book, and so, 26 or something at the end, and had gone through all of these hardships and had found, I think, all of this heroism in herself, but hadn't experienced so much of life. And that was partly what I had to say sort of about, coming of age during this kind of a time and not really sort of finding out who she was apart from the war.
Tell you about the current neo-Nazi uproar.
I'm sorry, say that again?
My question is, what do you believe that Isabelle would do about the current day neo-Nazi uproar?
Well, that sort of goes back to what I was saying about the book being surprisingly relevant. And I think that the bigger question is not necessarily what Isabelle would do, because I think that Isabelle would pretty much fight on any front. But I think the question is, how does the Nightingale and reading about it impact what you would do about it, what we would do about it, what we would teach our children to do about it, how we pass these lessons along and how we actively learn from history. So to me, that's more what it's about, I guess.
Hi, my name is Sarah.
Hi.
Throughout the Nightingale, a lot of gender stereotypes are questioned, especially with women. But the father's stereotype as non-caring and sort of cold toward his two abandoned daughters doesn't necessarily change until push really comes to shove. So is there a reason why you put it that way? Is it the historical era, or are you kind of trying to prove a point?
That's an interesting question. The way my process works, the way I write my books, is I write a lot of drafts and I throw a lot of pages away, which means that I have written a version where it was just Isabelle. I have written a version where Isabelle and Vianne were twins. I have written a version where they were best friends. I'm constantly following the story to the moment that it begins speaking to me. And with the father, I have done the same thing. I have drafts where he was a great guy. I have drafts where they loved him. But the bottom line was that in my research, the thing about France that was so, I guess, compelling and so formative in this time was they had just lost a generation of men in World War I. And it was not that many years between World War I and the time that we're dealing with at the start of World War II. And their father was clearly came home with what we now know as PTSD. And, the trench warfare of World War I was brutal. And so I wanted him to come home broken, and I wanted him to sort of remain broken until he was called upon by these new circumstances to change. And so in my personal opinion, he always loved the girls. Who he didn't love was himself, and who he had problems with was his own past. And I think, some people sort of saw that in the manuscript, and some people didn't. So I think, that's the interesting thing about books is readers do get to bring their own interpretation into the work, and everybody's opinion is every bit as valid as mine on, what he was and who he was. Hi.
My name is Sarah, and my question for you is regarding Captain Beck. He was one of my favorite characters in the book.
He was what?
He was one of my favorite characters in the book.
Oh, really?
Well, I don't know. I just found him very interesting. And so my question is, how did you come across, or how did you decide to have him die, and what kind of was your purpose behind that?
That was actually interesting because that's one of those, that moment in the barn where they, shoot him. It's one of those rare, super rare moments that I don't see coming either. And I did not know that they were going to shoot him until they shot him. And so it happens, and I'm like, okay. Do I keep this? Do I edit this? Do I change it? And I thought, this is a moment where I can turn the book on its head. Let's follow that and see where it goes. And and I was watching Breaking Bad at the time. This is true. And I was so amazed by the fact that every week it got worse. Like something worse happened every week. And so I thought, well, okay, what would be worse than Beck? And that, led me to Von Richter. So.
My name is Pat. I have a question about your research. Where did you go to do your research? Or did you do it at home or wherever? And what process did you use to bring the historical into the novel?
So the way I went about it, I had not written a big, fully historical novel before. So the way I did it was I started with sort of the general World War II, Europe, France. You start with the biggest topic first and read everything that I could, what was going on with Europe, starting from about, the end of World War I. Start reading everything you can. And then, it siphons down a little bit to now I'm really reading only about France. And then it comes down to, well, now I'm really reading about Paris and the Loire Valley. And I pick, I don't like what's going on with Lyon. I don't like what's going on here. So I begin to sort of shape my story. And that leads me ultimately to what are the most valuable books for me, which are the memoirs, of the people who were living at the time. And that's where I get, I would say, the bulk of my intimate knowledge. And then what it turned out that I had to do with this book that I had never had to do before, I had to write like a skeletal book that was just the history, scene by scene, of this is what was happening in March of 39, April of 39, of 40, you know, and I just wrote all of those scenes. And when I had the whole skeleton of the book in place, then the job was to create living, breathing people that you cared about. But I couldn't seem to do it all at once. It was just too big. So it was research first, and then writing in the characters. Because at that point then I could stop. Every time I wrote a paragraph, I'd have to look to research material. Oh, and I did say to my husband at some point, you know, I think I need to go to France. And so we did, tragically. And so we went for a month and we followed Isabelle's route. And I hired historians and spoke to survivors, and that's when the book really came together.
Hi, Kristin. My name is Barbara.
Hi, Barbara.
I'm alum class of 1997, 20 years out now. Huge fan of your work. I've been had the entire fly lane.
Oh.
Before I started, and I believe I've made my way through most of your novels. The Nightingale really touched me. But I know you have The Great Alone coming out, and I'm sure you're excited about that. I'm wondering if we're able to get a little bit of a teaser of this based in Alaska.
Okay.
And also, as a writer, are you nervous about the new novel coming out after the huge success of The Nightingale?
You think? I considered retiring. Yeah, I mean, it was, it was really difficult, actually, to follow The Nightingale because, you know, I was into the new novel when it sort of hit and became, you know, this more than just a successful book, certainly nothing like I've ever had before. And so I wanted to write a book that was completely different. I wanted to write a book that couldn't be compared to The Nightingale. This was what I decided to do. I may have been drinking at the time. And so I decided to write a book set in Alaska that was a domestic thriller with an unreliable narrator that went backwards in time. So I did. I wrote this book. And as I was coming to the end of it, Girl on a Train came out. And then the next Girl on the Boardwalk, I don't know, wherever. These girls just started appearing. And they all were unreliable narrators. And so about, I don't know, I'd probably say 2 years into the book, I thought, I don't want to do this. This isn't, I shouldn't have done this in the first place. I don't think that my book, the one I was writing, was good enough. I didn't think it was good enough to follow The Nightingale. So I threw it away. That was about 2 years of work. The only thing I kept was Alaska. I loved, loved, loved this setting. And so instead, it became a novel set in the 1970s. And it's about a Vietnam vet who, again, has undiagnosed PTSD. I do not have this, by the way. But I am so fascinated by it. And I came of age during the Vietnam War, and I saw firsthand, you know, the men coming back and the way we treated them, and it has stayed with me forever. And so I wanted to sort of write about this. And so this man is having a hard time. He's having, you know, he can't keep down a job. He's having issues. And someone leaves him a house in really, really, really remote Alaska. And he thinks this is a good idea to go. It turns out for his wife and daughter not to be such a great idea. And so it's how this family in crisis and how this girl coming of age in the 70s deals with life in the wilderness. And it's interesting because, again, it was what was going on in our modern political landscape that made me look to the 70s and say, you know what, this is relevant again. And so anyway, that's The Great Alone. It's out in February.
Thank you. At this time, we are going to first thank you all for taking part in such an enjoyable event. Ms. Hannah, you are now a Notre Dame woman.
Yay! Yay!
I would like to present you with a gift of appreciation.
Oh, thank you.